Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here and leading this panel. And I think it's a panel where we will be moving beyond the technocentric, scientific, hard science stuff, and to where it will all end up, I guess, or might end up. First, I have four very interesting panelists here. And I think we'll start just with short introductions. I have my first speaker here is Alejandro Argumedo. You're from the Asociación Andes, right? What's that? What kind of organization is that, and what is your own role there?
It's a small NGO, indigenous NGO, based in Cusco, Peru, which focus its work on independent research and support of indigenous peoples and small farmers' food systems. So we do a different type of work associated to traditional knowledge. Of course, the policy around it, and pretty much involved in policy fora related to human rights and environment.
Okay, and what would be your first association with gene editing from that perspective?
Well, why we believe our indigenous voices need here. Usually indigenous peoples are thought to be head shrinkers and witchcraftery and that kind of thing. But if you see a map of the world, you will easily recognize that all the centers of crop origin, from where this genetic diversity that CRISPR is going to, or tries to edit, have been developed, have been created by indigenous peoples. And in those areas, we still keep hundreds of genetic diversity on which the food system of the world depends for its viability, and associated to it a knowledge system about how this very complex environment works and how the culture itself has created diversity, and that culture needs to be protected along with the communities and its ecosystem. Okay. So a technology like CRISPR that focus on expanding far and wide genetic manipulation into the environment is very worrisome for us.
Yeah. We'll get back to that later on. The second speaker here is Robert Deerenberg of Blue Genomics Chile. It's a salmon breeding company, right?
Yes.
Tell me more about that.
Blue Genomics is a consortium owned by AquaGen. AquaGen is one of the bigger salmon breeding companies, and Blue Genomics does the R&D for AquaGen, and also looks after breeding work directly.
And what's your own role there?
I lead both the group of researchers within the Blue Genomics, but also the genetic department in AquaGen. So it's both research and the practical application of.
Just shortly for now, your company does not yet at this moment use genetic GM. That of course genetic techniques, but not GM.
No,
right?
no, we have not been and
previous generation.
Yes, at this moment we are not. It's only in the R&D stage.
Okay, we'll also get back to that. My first speaker here is Coenraad Krijger, director of IUCN NL. So we know IUCN from the red list, but what more do you have to offer?
Well, a recent report on the relations or the potential of synthetic biology, and potential both in positive and negative ways regarding nature conservation. IUCN is a global union. It says Union for the Conservation of Nature, so it provides a platform of over 1,300 organizations and governments worldwide, which are concerned with nature and nature conservation. So that includes, like I said, government, and of course NGOs, all the big conservation and environmental NGOs, but also local community organizations, indigenous organizations, knowledge institutions.
Like theirs, for instance?
Yeah, belong to 2 or 3 commissions.
Yeah.
And like Alejandro said, there's IUCN is also more known to the wider public because they work by the commissions, which have 6 of them. One of them is focusing on species conservation. They produce the red list.
Yeah.
But there's other commissions also on the economic relationship with nature conservation or communication and education aspects or ecosystem management. So there's a lot to offer. Basically, it's a global standard-setting organization. It's not moving fast because of the platform and the diversity. It also includes zoos, for example, but also animal welfare organizations. So once IUCN takes a position, it takes a while, but it's usually sort of... Well,
it stays a while.
Common ground. That's right.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. And so the last speaker here is Aditi Market. You're from the Australian National Science Agency, right? That's easier to name than the acronym. Land and Water in Brisbane.
That's right.
So what's your department doing? What's your role there?
So I have 2 roles within CSIRO. The first is to lead a team of social and economic scientists who look at issues related to biosecurity and biocontrol. And then the second half of my time is to lead the social science agenda for our synthetic biology future science platform. So CSIRO has invested quite a lot in future science platforms, of which SynBio is one. So within the social science application domain, we look at, social, ethical, institutional issues related to future technologies.
And you've done this whole survey on more or less part of this topic that we'll be discussing today. Here.
Yeah, that's right. So within the Future Science platform, we have many new technologies emerging from that, and they cut across environment and sustainability issues, as well as industrial biotechnology and health and medicine. So we've recently completed a national survey in Australia, just to kind of get a baseline understanding of where people sit on various applications or future applications of SynBio. And it's the first, I guess, in Australia to really focus on future technologies and broken kind of attitudes down related to that.
Okay. Well, first we'll just go on to the topics. And interesting, because you've done a survey, you have this report, your colleagues produced it. So what kind of themes were in there? What kind of issues are we speaking about here? Maybe you could start from your report.
Yes, so it was focusing. It's not produced by IUCN staff. It's produced by scientists, a commission, an international multidisciplinary commission, which reviewed the existing literature and brought together the expertise regarding synthetic biology and nature conservation. Yeah. So, and in general, you could say the conclusion was it has, well, it's not surprising, but it has potential. But it has threats as well to nature conservation, and it's all. It's very difficult to have general rules for it yet, if any, and it's definitely not a silver bullet for sustainable development.
And could you give some examples of like specific of examples that were used in the report that were treated more in depth or named at least?
Yeah, so we recently also, it was about the same time, I think, the IPBES report, it was the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystems, produced the state of the world's biodiversity. And if you look there, then you have several, it's very clear what the causes are of nature and biodiversity loss worldwide. So it's habitat loss and degradation is by far number one. Yeah. Then there's over-exploitation. And there are things like climate change, pollution, and invasive species. So if you look at the potential of technologies like CRISPR, then you look, for example, to individual species. You would like to if you want to save, like we had a wonderful example of some sort of dream type of application of the technology to save an endangered species. That's one of the applications. We just saw one, but there's also, for example, recently a larger group, amphibians in the last 10 years have been hit worldwide by fungal diseases. Mm-hmm. Well, you can easily imagine the same as you use CRISPR technology for human health, that you could use it for animal health and saving species who are threatened by diseases. On the other hand, is you could also say that, like I said, one of the biggest threats to nature and biodiversity worldwide is habitat loss, and one of the big drivers behind there is industrial agriculture, which is monocropping and high yield production purposes. And of course, if you use these technologies to boost that, then you come into the area of will or will it not lead to more habitat destruction, or the sharing or sparing dialogue. And I understood it was there yesterday, but that's, I think, for nature conservation a major issue when it comes to the potential drawbacks of this technology.
I saw you were writing down something with when he was talking about the species. Was it about what he was saying? Or?
Member of CISP, the Commission Economic and Environmental Social Policy. And this report that you mentioned has been highly criticized for being biased. And the gentlemen that were asked to do the report were from the beginning leaned towards favoring synthetic biology. That's very well known fact within IUCN commissions itself. So I don't know how valid this report may be.
And what for instance, was the critique, except from
the
biased?
The composition of the panel itself.
So you wouldn't trust their judgment because they might be biased
because it was not elected in a democratic way according to IUCN own rules. But
do you also know some of the criticism about the report itself, about what's in there?
Well, one can conclude that if you have people that are obviously in favor of synthetic biology, the report is going to go for it.
So then,
so there's no need to go into the details.
Maybe let's, if we're talking about the species, it would be interesting also to move to Robert, because you are working with the species you have to conserve, but the species you want to produce. So what? And you are not, you haven't been using GM, right? What was the reasoning behind that, to not do that in the previous generation, so to say?
Mainly because the old techniques include foreign DNA in a species that also lives in the wild, which means a high risk when salmon escapes. That this foreign DNA will get into wild stocks. That's the main, has been the main reason, and also acceptance from the consumers.
But some other companies have done it, right? Or
there's just one company, but all the big salmon breeding companies have not used it, and they produce the genetics for almost every salmon in the world.
And you haven't made up your mind in your company whether or not CRISPR and related techniques might be suitable. What are the arguments there?
We're definitely looking at this new technology because actually it gets around the downsides of the older technology. That means not introducing foreign DNA, which could be a solution. So it could be a very interesting tool in several aspects. Not necessarily to modify the salmon we sell or the genetics we sell, but also as a research tool to create a bigger understanding.
Do you have examples of that?
Yes, CRISPR could be a convenient tool to understand better which genes are involved in which traits, which is actually a lot more difficult than it sounds. And when you know better how everything works, you can breed in a more precise way, and the more precise you are, the faster the progress, which is very important for...
to make the process you're already doing smarter?
Yes.
Yeah. But for instance, you can read the stories on about the Supercell Man that's bigger and that's growing faster. Would that be an option, or maybe not?
That would definitely be an option. Sustainability is more than only looking at biodiversity and wild stocks. Sustainability is about efficient use of resources, animals that convert or are highly efficient in converting resources into the desired product. Less antibiotic use, less pesticides, that's all are very important environmental and sustainability issues.
Mm-hmm.
They're the main focus of our clients.
Yeah.
So yes, a salmon that grows fast, is resistant, is definitely, in our eyes, sustainable.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's the risk people are discussing, and I see people here thinking that maybe. What if that salmon ends up outside of your breeding place, outside of your farm?
Yes. In our point of view, of course, there is a risk, as there is a risk today. It's because of that risk. The main reason for us not to work with foreign DNA in our salmon is because of that risk. Mm-hmm. But of course, where you have our cultivated crops, there is always a risk of salmon escaping and mixing in with the wild stocks.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, sterile fish could be a solution to that. To that problem.
So to make fish sterile by applying CRISPR, for instance.
Yeah, for instance, that could be a solution. Actually, it has already been done. We were involved in a project, yes, several years ago already. So that is a possible solution, but it has been an R&D phase. And first of all, it's technically very difficult to do this on a big scale. It's our clients don't buy 1 or 2 fish; they buy millions of eggs. So that's a problem if you have to produce sterile fish. Mm-hmm. And there's also a big part of the research is what happens if the sterile fish, they don't reproduce, but they compete for food outside the cages. And there's a lot of things we don't know about that yet.
Yeah. So what would you think of that idea? Like, when it's explained about the fish.
I was just thinking about the sustainability issue and how the Shuswap in interior BC and Canada, or the Tuliap tribes in Washington state would think they have evolved or co-evolved with salmon. Salmon is part of the ritual, or salmon is part of the family. Mm-hmm. So you have to have respect as in their species, and there's not that relationship that where sustainability is just money. Mm-hmm. Sustainability, I think, has to do with the profound respect that we have to keep for Mother Earth, mm-hmm. because that's where it sustains all. And I think here in this debate between how these new technologies can be applied, we need more epistemic diversity. We need to consider other ways of knowing, mm-hmm. other ways of doing. Because science, this Western science, is not the only science. It's not the only knowledge that's applied in the world. Indigenous peoples, maybe 300 million only mm-hmm. in the world, but we keep most of the biodiversity in the world. Forests, agrobiodiversity, fish, all those are maintained by communities that have very strong link to the belief system that creates that Mother Earth is sacred. All the organisms are living beings that you have to have different type of respect. So when we are brought into this discussion and we have to accept the Western modernity, we have to accept this scientific rationality, and we have to accept the rule of the law in terms of intellectual property, or in terms of how our rights are treated from a colonial perspective. It's very difficult to participate like this.
Yeah, you mean like that? Just you have a totally different attitude towards the whole idea of progress and different thoughts on that.
Well, you know, like this is a whole debate. What is progress? You know, is it where are we going with this type of consumption that we have now? Is it progress? You know, I come from a country that domesticated 130 crops. We have a 10 years moratorium on GMO, Peru. We have more than 4,000 varieties of potatoes. We don't need more. We have high diversity of crops with different shapes, colors, taste, texture, that have very high nutritional content. So this technology doesn't make sense for us. For us, what makes sense is to keep having a good relation with the land so that we can maintain that diversity. In the last 10 years of moratorium of GMOs in Peru, we have a thriving gastronomic activity. There's more conservation of consciousness about the real value of our crops. And I think that's the future of a food system that we would like to see.
Okay. Maybe we can also move, like, we are talking about different perspectives, but we haven't discussed the perspective of just the people that will eventually have to sort of accept technology. You've been studying that, right? Or surveying, at least. Could you tell more about, well, what were the themes there, and what were the responses of, and who was the audience? It was the general audience in Australia?
Yeah, that's right. So it was a representative sample of Australian citizens, and we sampled both. We sampled our Indigenous Australians as well. And before I kind of talk about that, I did want to reflect on what Alejandro was saying. I think when we talk about technology in the environmental space, certainly in Australia, we're acutely aware that our Indigenous Australians have a whole other knowledge of our landscape. And so it's really important to integrate that knowledge into the science that is coming out of these labs. And we don't know what Indigenous Australians think about gene technology, certainly not in an empirical sense, but I think that it's really important that their perspectives are included. I think those populations are usually mined for their information or their genetic diversity, and so I think it's only fair that they're part of that process of development.
Do you have any ideas of how that can be done?
We're trying to work on it, and every Indigenous population is different and requires or prefers different forms of engagement. So for us, I think the best approach is really co-development of research, and that's kind of the gold standard in terms of Indigenous Australian work. And so we're trying to get scientists and like biophysical scientists and social scientists together to kind of co-develop projects so that Indigenous knowledge is integrated. So that was just a side note. But for our survey, we asked some general questions about synthetic biology, defined what it was, because most people don't really know what it is. And I think in order for us to really get a good understanding of people's perspectives, we had to kind of break it down into particular technologies. So we couldn't just ask opinions in general about SynBio, but it had to be, this is a technology that would contemplate reintroducing diversity in an endangered species, or this is a technology of a pseudo-organism that's designed to reduce pollution. So we had to kind of be quite specific in our examples when we tested attitudes.
Mm-hmm. That's really focusing on solutions there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they were framed as problem-solution narratives. So I think we, through kind of our preliminary work, we kind of established that people want some sort of story to understand why the technology is coming about, why it's being prioritised over other things. And so we thought the best way to frame that was as a problem-solution kind of example.
But you didn't really focus a lot on risks, so you didn't want to scare them too much, but that could also be a dilemma, right? Because you don't want to push that away, the potential risks. They might not think of all these things.
Yeah, that's
right.
Know. So for the survey, we decided not to list a whole bunch of risks, mostly because we don't know what they are, because this is future-oriented technologies. We could hypothesize about what potential risks could be, but the idea of our survey was really to get self-generated thoughts about, what concerns them, what jumps out to you about the risks of this technology. And then I think that the next stage of our research would be to go on the ground and to interact kind of one-on-one in groups with people to tease out what risks might be there, because it's really hard to measure that in a survey, so that it has to be both qualitative and quantitative approaches.
Yeah. Like, Robert, what kind of questions and answers in such a survey would you, from your perspective, be interested in for your decision whether or not to go into that direction?
Yeah, I agree. It's difficult to see maybe the real risks. Depends on on what you really do. Actually, if you are editing and you make variants that already exist within the species, just to speed up the selection process, then we don't see big. At least I don't see big problem in that, because it's all an existing genetic variant. You only speed it up to have a higher frequency within a population.
Yeah.
But if you make different variants, then it's difficult to foresee what the real effects on the mid and long term could be. Yes, that is difficult.
But eventually it will, I think for a company, it will all end up. Eventually, it will be about whether or not the public, or in this case, the consumers, will accept a certain technology. I think. Do you have any thoughts on what will determine which direction that will go? The public opinion on this new generation of the technique.
Yeah, for now we have quite some experience with that, with the current GMOs, and there's at least in animal husbandry, very low acceptance for that. So our clients, the salmon farmers, they don't want these products.
Yeah.
So they're hardly being farmed.
Yeah.
And depending on how you look at CRISPR and how the public will look at this, because it's fundamentally different. It could be a future option. Yeah. But for now, and you see this during this debate, there's a lot of public concern.
Yeah. Just wanted to mention in the meantime that please send in your questions and rate the other ones, so that we can take you into account as well in the last part of the session. So yeah, what do you think, based on your survey, on where this might end up?
I think,
for the audience,
I think as a blanket statement in Australia, you could say people are not opposed to gene technology or synthetic biology technologies, but there is a high level of uncertainty, and it will really depend on what the applications are for, where they're intended to be implemented, and how relevant a particular outcome is for individuals. So I think a lot of this has to do with personal relevance. As you would know, if something doesn't really fall into your wheelhouse of understanding, then it's kind of a general opinion on synthetic biology, for example. But if we're talking about invasive pest management in your local town using a gene drive approach to control feral cats, then it's quite relevant. And so you would have a lot more deeper thinking about the issues and where you stand on particular things. So I think people aren't saying, no, we don't want it, but they are saying, we would like to know more about it and how does it impact me.
Yeah, that's also feeding into what your report is saying, right? The case-by-case approach and then dive deep and find out what it's really about.
Yes, if there's one thing which is important is that every case of application of these technologies is very specific with respect to what it can bring about. So one of the recommendations of the report is that if you do want to apply it, then you have to take it all the way. And then it's not just looking at the potential direct effects in positive and negative terms, but also consider it in a much wider context, socio-economic, cultural, religious, and also a point which I think was concluded and is really important because it's often forgotten when you look at it from the point of view of the technology and the people developing the technology. It's the governance of how to deal with the technology, and by this I mean how do you ensure that the technology is used where it's to be used for, or that it's controlled, that it's regulated, and what do you do if it isn't? Who owns the technology? Questions like this, and these are obviously always way behind the advances in science. I think we have many examples of this. So I would say governance issues, and I'm not sure whether there are many governance experts in this hall today, but I think is one of the key issues, and the next panel will go into it, and I think rightfully so. And because people do different. There are very different views on this possible. Like there are many different views on technology and its purpose in general, and I think we have to be realistic. The technology is there, so it's going to be used. It will be cheap, it will be available, so it will be open to do-it-yourself biology. People can just do it. They can take it across borders. They can use it they can purchase it for one purpose. You could use it for another. But we should also be realistic that it's no longer the Western scientific world and technology push who is driving things. If you look at it from conservation, the largest parts of wilderness are managed by people who think very differently when it comes to these technologies, and so you have to take them into account. So be realistic, both that the technology is there, and at the same time also be realistic on how it is viewed.
Yeah. Like Alejandro, he was referring to indigenous organizations. I can imagine it can be a dilemma there might be some kind of pragmatic solution that can really benefit the conservation goals that you're striving for, but at the same time, it feels a little bit against your thoughts and principles. How would you be trying to solve that dilemma?
We have to remember history. We had like 500 years of very hard to even think colonial domination. Only in 2007 we were considered peoples. We were population, then we became issue, and then with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, finally we have a set of rights standards at the international level that oblige countries to respect and protect the rights of native people all over the world. And it is our belief, at least in the network I represent, that we have to keep working within the context of our own epistemological construct, which is work with Mother Nature. Yeah. Work in respect with what is the sacred, what is the wild, and what are human needs, and seek a balance. But these type of technologies, that are produced by Western science, perhaps should be contained here in Europe or in North America.
Yeah.
And I think we would like to be left alone.
Yeah. Do you think that there would be like any kind of application then that would be suited within the things that you would like to see, or only in a
I would like to
specific way?
see, some gene editing for corruption.
I think that's it. Maybe any suggestions here?
We have like our last 5 presidents are in jail. So that would be very helpful. That would be awesome. But seriously, if this conversation can continue, we have to include more voices. I think beyond Christianity, Buddhist, Islam, and other religions should participate and democratize it. Bring other type of people into this discussion, because so far it's just within this room, it's all everybody's patting their back, feeling good. Let's go. The genie is out of the bottle. Let's make magic. And reality is not that. Whatever you do in one part will affect the rest of the world. So we have to, I think, be very careful. And as for indigenous peoples, I think prior informed consent should be the rule. And this is something that is enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and ILO 169. And I hope that this forum takes it into account.
Okay, and so you are like, to a large extent, at the same, having the same same thoughts on this, but not exactly, right? Because IUCN has more like this more pragmatic statement on, well, sometimes it might be too risky, sometimes not. So how would you then, if we move on with this debate, try to combine that? So as an organization, you see some benefits, maybe some opportunities, maybe also for saving certain or bolstering certain species, but at the same time, you have to constantly be aware of the perspectives of the people that are very close to the problems.
Sure, and whatever you do, I very much agree with including multiple voices and ways of thinking, and not just because it's democratic or because it's the right thing to do, but also because you really get different types of knowledge. And even if you stick within the Western science world, it's the ecological knowledge when applying these types of technology or science or social scientific knowledge is often not used, or it's used later on when there's damage or there's issues to come up with new solutions. So make use of what is known in other disciplines, especially if you are focusing on these, if you want to further the technologies, and consider it in a multidisciplinary way, and multidisciplinary within science, and then you could say include by, you go wider with the different worldviews that we have and the different ways. And just to say an example, IUCN is pragmatic, yes, because for some, if the purpose is to save a specific species from extinction, and you know exactly what to do, and then maybe a CRISPR technology can help to speed things up or to make sure that you can save a species within time. You can consider this, of course. Then it can be a solution. There are several examples of doing this. Or more negatively, you can try to. Now pesticides are used to control invasive species, which is of course has huge impacts. If you can do it in a cleaner way,
so
by
replacing one technology by another.
But I think we should be aware that if you're doing so, what you're doing is you're within a certain way of thinking, and it's quite limited thinking with technological solutions. And if you include it in a wider perspective, you may mix it. For example, there's all kinds of ecological and agroforestry techniques which may be traditional or which may be developed by Wageningen at some point or at different places in the world, and combining these technologies or new varieties with existing diversity and existing knowledge on how to cultivate things in a sustainable way. I think these mixed types of approaches are the way forward.
Not to dichotomize between this specific technique and organic or same as in farming, not have this distinction, but to use in a sustainable way the combination of several techniques.
Well, if you want to focus on solutions, I think you need to be open to mixed approaches rather than to try to fight over which is the right angle, which happens a lot in nature conservation and in NGOs in general, that there's a lot of fight about who is right.
Yeah.
Whereas usually when you really look at the case-by-case basis, mixed approaches could well be considered or need to be discussed with different people that are involved.
Yeah. Like Robert, you're based in Chile, right? Your company.
Yes.
So
well,
do you have experience
among
with
other countries?
Yeah, among other countries. But so do you have experience as well with such debates with the people in the country?
Yeah, there are always debates. First of all, I wanted to mention something. CRISPR is a new technology, is a new tool. And there are many new tools, and I want to take out this race thing, because if it's Western or if it's discovered in China or wherever, it doesn't matter. It's a new tool, and every new tool should be studied and see what kind of applications it have. And people that work, for example, in salmon breeding, we first start with the upsides. If there are no upsides, then we don't have to study the rest.
Yeah.
As simple as that. And if we see possible applications, then we have to be very careful and also look at all the downsides and start the discussion with people that could be directly affected. And again, it doesn't matter where the technology comes from. It does matter in the area where you're operating that you involve all the stakeholders, but also people that can be affected. Yeah. So, yeah, that is a very important discussion with every new tool that can be applied, but also tools maybe that are already applied can be discussed.
But is it also like the role for a company like yours to have such discussions? Not like here, but organize yourselves with people in your own country, in the country of where the company is based or working, or is that not something for you, only to participate when someone else organizes?
Well, the first clearly within a company, the first step is to look at the R&D, at the practical application. When we think that something is really, really interesting and we are at the level, or we are about to be able to apply a new technology, then definitely there's a time to have a discussion. We can discuss if it's the breeding companies, it's the producers, it's the people that retail, that buys the salmon. Yes, of course, there will be a discussion. Presence in events like these is an opportunity, but there are many more opportunities. Yes, it's definitely very necessary.
How do you think that indeed, like this larger audience and not just the general audience is always very vague, but how can they be included more in a better way?
I guess Robert is right in that traditionally research and development is kind of focused on first, and then engagement with relevant publics is kind of follows that process. But I think more and more we need to start rethinking that model and trying to include communities at the very beginning, because they're the ones who will have to kind of buy into this technology or the solution that's being provided, and they may have a very unique perspective on what it is the problem is that exists, because the way that a scientist might see it could be very different to somebody living in that particular context. And so I think we should actually start involving people from the very beginning, say, okay, this community has a problem, how can biophysical and social scientists work together to kind of develop a solution for that? So I think that would be a really great way to get more people involved.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else wants to add?
Yeah. I'm not so sure about that viewpoint. Depends on the kind of research you're doing, but many research that is being conducted is very fundamental, and you don't see the practical applications until later. So if you have that discussion too early, I think that will be a very bad thing for science. If you do research in a lab that doesn't necessarily have a big impact on the society, until the moment you find an application for it. So, but limiting research in a too early stage because of a discussion while you not really understand what the future applications or implications could be, that's I don't think that's a good idea.
I would challenge that.
Yeah, why?
So I agree that there are very fundamental bits of science that need to be done and can be done in parallel. But I also think, certainly in Australia, we're trying to develop a new generation of biophysical scientists who are thinking about the potential applications of their work. So no matter how small their part of the puzzle is, I think it's really important that the new generation does start to think about the role that their work has in society. And yes, I agree that there are fundamental processes that need to be developed, and certainly within the Synthetic Biology Future Science platform, we have a stream of science that is just about developing those building blocks used in synthetic biology. But they will eventually be integrated, and they may be commercialized at some point. And so this kind of broader perspective of how science fits into society, I think is a really good thing to start to develop.
You want to add something?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think if companies or business want to be sustainable, want to modernize, want to go to the future, they have to be more open. They have to involve its consumers, its constituency, into this discussion, because you don't know what may happen if something goes wrong. Mm-hmm. And I would go a little bit further. I would say that any research, and this should be co-researched by communities that may be affected.
Mm-hmm. I want to make a remark on that. I don't say that research has to be done behind closed doors. It should be transparent and open, but I question if it should be a democratic process. I question that more than hide it. I'm not saying that.
Yeah, but like sometimes it's just it's unknown what we're talking about, unknown who will be affected, so who to include there,
CRISPR is a technology that's a good example. It's been very transparent, it's open, that's why we're sitting here and discussing about it. But I don't agree that maybe we come to a stage where we should really start discussing about the practical applications, but not in an early stage make it a democratic process and stop maybe essential investigation. But yes, it should be transparent, and I think that has been very transparent.
Yeah. We're talking a lot about stakeholders and people involved, but those stakeholders can also be conflicted, right? Sometimes a farmer really wants to use less pesticides, might also be useful for people around him or her, but at the same time others are against that. So then we're not only talking about the scientists versus the public, but then they'll have to sort of sort it out. How to solve those problems?
Well, I think in general, I mean, science is of course best done by scientists. They've been trained to do so, and it's a profession. At the same time, and scientists try to be free of values and focus on the scientific method, which is trying to. So at the same time, the rest of the world isn't.
Mm-hmm.
So, and especially if you're dealing with, if you're re-engineering life, so in life sciences in general, but I think also as a scientist, it is a modern way, and we cannot afford to do it differently than to inform yourself about the public debate, concerns, and other types of issues that are connected to what you're directly interested in. I mean, I think modern science is crucial to our world, and this means that science needs to be informed, and scientists need to inform themselves about the other issues, whether they like it or not, or whether they're interested or not, which are related to what they are doing or potentially could be doing. And there's always a debate on how much time and effort should be put on this, but I think in general this, science as a separate activity, transparent or not, but just concerned with certain technology is not of these times.
Yeah, but you still seem to suggest here, and I'm now oversimplifying what you were saying maybe, but that the people out there will have a certain opinion that might be something different, but they are all different kinds of opinions and different stakes, different interests.
Inform yourself about these opinions and why they have these opinions, or whether there are concerns behind it. I mean, that's not that difficult to be interested in other people's views.
Yeah, but that's for the scientists. But then the other people will have to sort it out as well, right? Amongst each other, whether or not do we want that application. In Peru, for instance, or not. Some people will be in favor of it, some will be against it. How you have the moratorium now for GM? How did that come into place? There might also have been people against that.
It was social movements, civil society, scientists, chefs, and different members of society come together to force this moratorium. And the main reason is because we are center of crop origin. With domesticated, as I said, more than 130 crops with huge diversity of expressions. So all the gene expressions that we need are there.
Yeah.
So I don't see, or we don't see, the application of this type of tools unless it has only some corporation interest in trying to monopolize seeds or the food system that we have.
And was that the only opposition from the companies, from some companies, or was there other resistance as well towards this position?
99% of our seeds come from the informal sector in potato, 97% in most other crops. So we don't have a seed industry as concentrated as in Europe. So we have to protect what we have right now and build from there. So I don't see how these type of technologies will benefit us.
Yeah.
But I want to perhaps I would just say something about how you include people. We see in the Chinese example, how this tool can be used.
Yeah, like the baby. You mean the baby example?
Yeah, and that tells you how far you can go.
Yeah.
And I think it is an issue of human rights, and the human rights angle must be brought into the discussion here.
Yeah.
And also, I don't think you need everyone to agree. I think that you will never get everybody on the same page about a single thing, and it's okay,
I think we are moving to the questions as well, from the audience. So the first one, the most popular one, is also focusing on this, whether or not the technology is bad, or the way it's applied, but then from a business perspective. So the question would be, should we regulate or ban harmful business models instead of a specific technology that's being applied? Anyone wants to answer that one or comment on that one?
That sounds to me more plausible than banning a technology that has many good applications, which could be very beneficial. CRISPR is an example of that. You can there's many different possible applications. We've just seen wildlife preservation, but you can also apply it in different ways, which would be maybe highly discussable.
I see an arm there. Is that related to this question or?
A little bit broader.
Yeah.
As interesting as this talk was, the title was double helixes and the circular economy.
Mm-hmm.
Circular economy implies a significant transition in the logics and practices of
Yeah.
economy. So in the economic models, the business logics and innovation logics. So my question would be, what are the institutions in current models of economy that need to change to develop a circular economy logic in innovations in life sciences?
Yeah, can you
Can you repeat the question?
I'll try to repeat your question because it was also difficult to hear for me. And the rest of the question we will just address through the app. I don't know, maybe you haven't installed it, but so how we would be able to apply these techniques in order to move towards a circular economy? Would that be just the question, or?
No. What would be the current institutions in the economy that need to change to move towards a circular economy? Do we have a microphone? Yeah.
Well, actually, it's not really facilitated because we have the app. So we'll just stick to this question, and then we'll move to the system we have. I'm sorry for that. Is anyone has any thoughts on that idea, that question? And then we also move back to the other one.
I didn't get a question.
I think it's because it's a broad topic we didn't really address in the panel. So how the current institutions will have to change in order to, like for instance, regulatory bodies or governmental or scientific institutions.
So yes, I think eventually everybody agrees that if you make such a fundamental shift in something fundamental like how the economy functions, then institutions will need to adapt, and you need different types of business models, and they need to. So I think everybody agrees on this sort of transformative change which is needed, which is the thing is, what can you do until you have this? There's always this short term, long term. On the long term, this is what you need, so you need to start thinking about them now. At the same time, there's urgent issues that need to be solved, and you can also try to solve them within the current business models. So if there's all kinds of good solutions for CRISPR technologies and there's startups that can boost it, then you can still use them. So it's a combination. It's not that simple as whether we should do this or this, I think.
Yeah. But if you keep bringing up solutions within the current system, you'll never end up at the solution. Yeah. So maybe
especially with climate change.
Yeah, and maybe about the one short comment about because you were answering the last question. Maybe some short comment on that, on whether we should not focus on the technology but more on the way it's being applied or the businesses. I think we all know the debate about Monsanto, whether or the problem is GM or the way they are dominating the market and putting their power there. You all seem to sort of yeah. I think that. What would you think? Because you seem to be more like having problems with the inherent technology and less, not just with the way it's being capitalized.
Yeah, as I said, we don't see benefits in this technology, but the potential problems that it might bring are tremendous, especially for farming communities, indigenous peoples, and in that regard, I think we know well how the big business models in the seed industry have monopolized all the means of agricultural production. So, you know, it seems that with capitalism there's always concentration, and you end up with one or two guys like owning everything.
It might be like a theoretical distinction between the technology and the business models, because in this current system you would eventually end up with that.
Exactly.
The next question is, yeah?
Maybe also another one around litigation, because we were having some problems in...
Oh, okay.
So this is also a question that relates to the discussion, I think.
Okay. The question is, how can we protect and maintain those origin of diversity regions in a world where it is tempting for farmers to transfer to intensive farming? Should I repeat it, or because it's such a? How can we protect and maintain those origin of diversity regions in a world where it is tempting for farmers to transfer to intensive farming? So the farmer can make more money by moving to intensive farming. The global population wants more food, but at the same time, there are problems with that.
We actually have an international network working on centers of crop origin, protecting them as food neighborhoods. Food neighborhoods being this strong link and co-evolution between food sources and the local culture, which expresses in a myriad of food, food diversity, cultural diversity, and where economical activities are associated to the sustainable use of biodiversity. And it works well. In Peru, we have a center, we call it Potato Park. 6 communities protect more than 1,500 varieties of potatoes. There is micro enterprises, there's innovation being done, protection of wild crop relatives, and tourism, gastronomy. And I think that type of activities are sustainable in the long run. It provides the communities for an environment to continue experimenting, use the landscape as a living lab, so that the co-evolution between the culture and the crops can keep producing new varieties of potatoes and other crops. So I think it's possible to do that and do it with a low carbon economy and with a vision of sustainability.
So we're moving to the next one. It's also kind of related. What are your views on economically quantifying the value of nature and the environment? And if so, how should we do that then? So to value in.
In Australia, nature is very quantifiable because we have, a huge tourism industry based on our natural benefits or advantages, I guess. So I don't really have a view on it necessarily, but I know that based on that, there are decisions made about particular technologies to pursue. And in Australia, we get research funding from the government, but we also get it from industry. And that's where the bulk of our funding would or should come from. And so I think that it's certainly something that is being done, and it's important to do to get research funding sometimes.
Anyone else?
Yes, I think it's very important to demonstrate the economic value and potential of nature and biodiversity. But at the same time, I think about 15 years ago there was a general belief and hope that by including this economic value into the business models, that sustainable that business would become more sustainable, and I think the conclusion is that it's not worked. So it is helpful, especially if you look at it from an economic system, and it can help companies also that are wanting to green their business in order to monetize their relationship to nature. But it's definitely not the silver bullet that it was thought to be 15 years ago or 10 years ago when you had these special studies. It's part of the toolbox, and also in relation to the previous question, at the rate things are going now, especially also with industrial agriculture, what is needed is to protect biodiversity. And it's not done enough. So protect agricultural diversity, or the management, or create parks, or just the oranges of biodiversity in this world. These are also the places where agricultural productivity can potentially be really high, or it is already taken into production. The first need that is to be done is to basically protect it.
Yeah, I would add that I think this protection should be of not just biodiversity, but also cultural diversity.
Exactly.
Which is like a fundamental for this.
Yeah.
And the previous question, I think, was very hotly debated within IPBS, and the economical valuation of biodiversity was dropped by this panel of scientists in favor of more human relationship with nature approach.
I agree to some point, but I think it is very difficult to quantify it. I give you a very practical example. In Chile, salmon industry has been growing very strongly the last 20 years, and in parallel the industry has been growing very strongly. So it's very difficult to quantify what the real value of nature is. It's undiscussable that it's valuable, but express it in an economic value.
It's almost a contradiction to say economically value if it's not economically valued by itself. So you have to sort of come up with something. I think it's about time. We have time for one more, I see, or at least depends on how quick you are. So the next question is on intentions, not so much on technique, but for instance, should regulation also take that into account, the intention of a specific technique, or the way it's been applied, for instance, saving an extinct bird versus creating super salmon, for instance. Should that come into play when we're talking about whether or not to allow a technique or application?
I think the reason that the technique is probably the thing that is regulated is because the rest of it is very subjective, right? So
Easier.
The intention is a very subjective thing to regulate, because different cultural expectations or community expectations mean that intention can mean very different things.
Mm-hmm.
So I suspect that's why.
And there's
it's
also a lot of
technical.
unintended things happening, right?
Yeah.
So that's tricky.
Yeah.
But should it be part of the discussion at least, when you're talking about whether or not to allow something?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's part of
It's
the
for
discussion.
risk balancing.
Yeah, you have a tool and you can use it in a good way, and you should allow it. And you use the same tool in a way you don't want people to use, then you don't allow that. You can regulate that by law, and not just forbid the technique because there are possibilities to use it in a bad way, but because there are many possibilities to use it as a useful tool in a good way. Now, if you have some side effects which were not intended, then and you can't control these unwanted side effects, then you could say for now you're not allowed. But if once you, because it's the control on these kind of tools is more and more sophisticated also, and I'm referring to sequencing. So if you made unwanted changes, you could probably in the future detect it. Well, you can't detect it yet, then maybe you should question if you could already apply it or not.
Yeah.
But just prohibit the tool is to my taste far too extreme.
Yeah. It's time to wrap up. I think we can wrap up with the next question that was there. Should we not do what works best and not what feels best? I think we in our panel we ended up somewhere in between that, I guess, between being case by case, but also taking into account the bigger picture and not only the technical issues at stake. I want to thank you all, and also thank you for sending questions, being here, and listening. And up to the next panel, and I think we first have a break.